The natural location of Frisco, Colorado connects a narrow, mineral-rich canyon with a rolling river valley. It was settled in 1875 because Frisco's founders knew it had the potential to become a stagecoach stop and hopefully a railroad hub. To make this happen, the town was named after the famous St. Louis-San Francisco Railway, commonly called the Frisco. Railway companies were eager to serve nearby mining towns because they made a lot of money hauling supplies in and mineral rock out. Smelters in nearby Leadville processed this rock ore for precious metals like gold, silver, copper, and lead. Frisco would serve the mining industry and the railways with food from its ranches and fuel from its land. To keep the trains, smelters, and mines running, Frisco provided timber from its tree-covered hillsides. Up to 2,400 acres of trees a year were cut down for lumber and fuel. Charcoal was also made to power the steam engines by slow-cooking seasoned wood inside charcoal kilns. 50 of the 100 beehive-shaped kilns were located in Frisco. So many trees were cut down that by the 1890s, the hillsides were cut bare. Today, ancient tree stumps surround Frisco, with taller ones as high as the snow when they were cut. Long before there was a town called Frisco, native hunter-gatherers followed migrating animals up to the area's high summer pastures. Local archaeological discoveries include fire pits, bone fragments, arrowheads, and tools that date to about 6,800 years ago. The most recent Native Americans to come through were primarily two tribes of Ute and their occasional enemies, the Arapaho. They roamed most of Colorado, Utah, and the Four Corners area of Arizona and New Mexico.
You think about what it was like with the Utes that were here for all those centuries. No buildings, no cars, no noisy airplanes. Peace.
The Utes were one of the first Native American tribes to ride horses in the late 1600s, courtesy of the Spanish. Occasional horse raids aside, the Spanish described the Utes as generally friendly, even providing early explorers with food. They traded until the 1700s. Western Native tribes began to be pushed off their lands by settlers with a series of treaties beginning in 1865. Forced relocation to reservations intensified in 1879 with the slogan, "The Utes must go." The Utes fought back with the Meeker Massacre that resulted in the Ute Removal Act a year later. Ute lands today are in southwestern Colorado, New Mexico, and northeastern Utah. One of the last local Utes to relocate was the 300-pound Colorado, shown here in 1887. The Utes remain to this day the longest inhabitants of Colorado. The first Europeans that came into Colorado were the Spanish in the 1600s, followed by the French and the English throughout the 1700s. They came to explore, but also to trap and trade fur with the natives. The United States bought the middle of the country in 1803, which included half of Colorado. This Louisiana purchase enticed even more pioneers to come for the lucrative fur business. These mountain men were usually young, strong, and adventurous. They worked for private companies and kept half of what they earned. A dozen or more traveled together because it was dangerous to work alone. If the wildlife or the native inhabitants didn't harm them, it would be the weather. They broke off into smaller groups as they reached the mountains, scouting first to find where the beaver were, then trapping in the fall when the beaver's fur thickened. Winters were spent at lower elevations in groups, sometimes with friendly Native Americans. Many mountain men adopted their ways by dressing in buckskins, sleeping in teepees, and a few marrying Native American women. The wetlands of Summit County were teeming with wildlife. A local trapping site near Frisco, known as Labonte's Hole, was abundant with beaver. This is where the Snake, 10 Mile, and Blue Rivers came together, which is now the Dillon Reservoir. The overtrapping of beaver fur for making hats and the change in demand for silk caused most white settlers to leave the area in the 1840s. The Colorado Gold Rush began in 1859 when gold was discovered near Denver, Colorado. Soon more discoveries were made throughout the state. The rush was short-lived as gold dust and nuggets that prospectors panned from the streams thinned out. They did find silver, but that was locked up in rock that needed to be drilled, blasted, hauled, and smelted. A Swedish stonemason named Henry Racine arrived in present-day Frisco in 1873, built a cabin, and began mining. By 1879, about 100 people called Frisco home. Frisco was surrounded by several mining camps and towns with names like Masontown, Curtin, Dickey, Robinson, Wheeler, Racine, and Kokomo. Today they are ghost towns due to many factors. First, the price of silver crashed in the 1890s because the government was mandated to buy the newly discovered silver. This created an oversupply, drove the price down, and made silver too expensive to mine. Towns also burned down, were buried by another mine's tailings, or were wiped away by avalanches. A few towns were relocated or torn down due to the construction of the Dillon Reservoir.
There are lots of artifacts around Frisco and in through the 10 Mile Canyon that will tell you the story of mining in this part of the county. Here, you needed a lot of investment money in order to develop those mines. So you had people going through the East Coast to the West Coast to try to find investors. Very often, more money went into that mine than came out.
Over a mile of hard rock tunnels were dug into Frisco's Mount Royal alone by the King Solomon Tunnel and Development Company. Hauling supplies, rock ore, and people by horse and wagon was slow and expensive. Railroads could move everything faster and cheaper. When gold and silver were discovered in the mountains of Colorado, railroads rushed in because there was big money to be made, or as they like to say, mind the miners. Smaller, lighter trains and tracks called narrow gauge were used. This made it easier to lay tracks and maneuver through the tight canyons and steep mountains. The first narrow gauge railroad to come through town was the Denver and Rio Grande in 1882. It ran alongside a wagon road where Interstate 70 between Frisco to Copper Mountain and Highway 91 to Leadville is today. A competitor steamed into Frisco a year later. The second railroad, the Denver, South Park, and Pacific Railroad, was forced to carve its tracks through the 10 Mile Canyon. This is now the recreational bike path that comes through Frisco. This steeper side of the canyon was regularly covered by avalanches and mudslides. Even though there were rotary snowplows to clear the tracks, men still had to shovel through first, clearing rocks and timber that would damage the plow. One tall tale told of plowing through cattle killed by an avalanche, and the frozen beefsteaks that were sent flying as a result. It used up to half of the railway's maintenance budget to keep the tracks cleared, which also meant that scheduled stops were often missed. This earned the Denver South Park the nickname Damn Slow Pulling and Pretty Rough Riding. The Denver and Rio Grande Railway stopped service in the 1920s, and the Denver South Park and Pacific Railroad pulled out in 1938.
But before they pulled up all the tracks, some men from Como in Park County put railroad wheels on a Model T Ford, put the Model T Ford on the tracks, and took their friends all on the tracks to the east to Bailey, to west toward Leadville, and they had a wonderful time all summer.
At one time, the railroad industry was one of the biggest employers after mining. Frisco during the 1880s was bustling with people. Main Street featured 3 hotels, 3 supply houses, blacksmith shops, and saloons. Frisco was reported to have every other shop without having any undesirables, like lawyers, gamblers, fallen women, or ministers. This was quite a boast, as Frisco did have its problems.
In October 1881, James McWalters was murdered in a saloon and billiard parlor here in Frisco. The jury was convened. They deliberated for 2.5 days while the body of James McWalters laid on the floor in front of them. They never did find who committed the murder.
The Schoolhouse Museum was originally built as a saloon in 1899, but probably never opened. The town converted it into a school in 1901. The bell tower was added a few years later from a former Breckenridge schoolhouse and is still used today. The Excelsior mine provided electricity to Frisco with its hydroelectric plant in 1899. When the mine closed in 1913, the town was left without power. By 1930, only 18 people lived in Frisco. The only industry left was ranching. Bill Thomas, a member of a local family, wrote letters to 100 people in Denver offering free plots if they built cabins within a year. They needed customers for their ranch and enticed them with the phrase, "home cooking with an abundance of milk and cream." It worked, and Frisco's neighboring community of Bill's Ranch was established. Frisco didn't boom again until the 1960s, when the white gold rush came with the opening of the surrounding ski resorts. This made the whole area an international destination as a winter playground. Then it became a spring, summer, and fall destination. Frisco is once again a supportive community to surrounding enterprises, as originally planned by its founders. Frisco's history is preserved in the Frisco Historic Park and Museum. Over a dozen buildings have been restored and are on display, including the Schoolhouse Museum, Frisco's first jail, several cabins, and Frisco's first dedicated church.